Welcome to the presentation on SQL Character Row functions. My name is John Mullins and I'll be your instructor for this module. If you have any questions throughout this module or throughout the course, feel free to use the question and comment box and we'll get back to your questions to you. All right, let's go ahead and get started and let's take a look at some character row functions. All right, in this particular module, here's what we're going to talk about. We'll mention the different categories of row functions that are available to us. Now in this module we're going to talk about character row functions, but there are other types available to us that you'll see in other modules in this course. Okay, how does a row function behave? How many times does it run? And how can we influence that? We'll see that in this chapter. And then what are some of the more common character row functions available to us? There are dozens of row functions available to us. These come from Oracle. They're already written for us. They've kind of sat down and thought about what are some useful reasons why people would need a function, and they've produced those for us, and we are able to take advantage of those. If we use PL SQL, we could write our own row functions, but in this case here, we're just going to take advantage of the ones that are available to us. All right, and then we can have a function within a function. So we'll see how to do that as far as nesting functions go. All right, so let's take a look at some things that are specific to row functions. They have to be part of an expression. So typically you'll see them in a select statement, really any kind of SQL statement. Select, insert, update, delete. If you're writing a PL SQL type program, it could be part of an assignment operator, assignment statement. It could be part of that. And this is the key part. They execute once for every row in the result set. Okay, so if your select is going to return 10 rows, your function will run 10 times. Okay, so we'll talk about how to limit the number of rows that we want to look at there. You can have a function that feeds another function, so a function within a function, so they can be nested, in other words. We'll see how to do that also. And then again, there are different types. We're going to look at the character row functions in this module, but we also have numeric row functions, date and time row functions, and then there are conversion row functions. And then some people might also throw in kind of a miscellaneous list as well. So you'll see there's a number of types. And again, there are dozens of row functions available to us that might be useful in our environment. All right, so let's take a look at some common character functions available to us. So we'll look at the function names first and kind of talk about what do they do, and then we'll look at some examples of what they do as well. So the first one here being upper. So again, it's a character function. So if we pass it a character string, it'll convert that character string to uppercase and pass us the result back. One thing to remember about all these functions is that they're pretty much single task in mind. They do one thing and only one thing. They take some input, they'll give you something back. That's one of the characteristics of a function, is it must return something. For example, the lower function. Similar to the upper, you give it a character string and it will return the lower case of that character string. Initcap, maybe not as obvious there, but this is how we're going to get mixed case. So for every separate word in the character string, the first character of that word will be uppercase and the rest of the characters of the word will be lowercase. So that's kind of a nice one to have if we're doing documentation or letters or resumes or things like that stored in our database. Concat, this is our way to do concatenation, so to append one character string to another, and the result is one character string. Now, it's somewhat limited and it only takes 2 arguments or 2 parameters. If you remember from an earlier module, you could also use the double pipe or the double bar to do the same thing. So we'll see some examples of that in this course also. And then you have substring, which you give it a character string, it'll give you part of that string back, depending on what parameters you pass to it. So for example, if I just want to see the first 3 characters of a character string, I can use substring to pull that out of a much larger character string. And then the last one here is length. And so I can give a character string to the length function, and he'll tell me how long it is. If you think about some practical uses for some of these functions, what about the length function? Have you ever been asked to change your password and it has to be a minimum length? Well, you type in your new password, and then they make you type it in again. And then what do you think they do behind the scenes to determine if it meets the minimum length requirements? They pass it to a function like the Oracle length function to see, is it 6, is it 8, whatever the minimum is. And if it meets that requirement, then you're okay. And if not, you get an error message. So, the length function's used a lot in like password verification routines. All right, let's look at some examples of the ones we just mentioned then. Here's one, the first one here, upper, lower, and a knit cap. Now notice here where we can also use more than one function in one statement, as we did here in this first example. We have the upper last name, the lower last name, and the init cap of the last name. So what that's going to give us in the result set is all last names in uppercase, all last names in lowercase, and all last names in mixed case for everybody who is in Department 10. Okay. The second one here gets a little bit more complicated in that it has the concat function, if you remember, appends one string to another, but remember it only takes 2 arguments as well. Okay, and so what we also have here is not only an example of how to use concat and how to use substring, but also how to nest one function inside another. Now, if you have one function inside another function, the innermost function will run first, get his results, and pass it to the outer function. Okay, so you can see what we're doing here is we're going to take first name and add a space to it. Okay, and then we're going to take that and append the last name. So the result of that first concat here is we're going to have the first name and then a space and then the last name. Rather than 2 columns or 3 columns, it's going to be one field, and it's going to be separated by a space. And then what are we doing here with the substring? Okay, we're passing it the last name field. The first field here says starting in position 1 and going for 3 positions. Okay, so we're displaying basically what? The very first 3 characters of their last name. And then we're also displaying the length of the last name for everybody who's in Department 10. Okay. Some other functions that are available to us, the instring function, so INSTR, the LPAD, RPAD, that's left pad and right pad, the LTrim, RTrim, left trim, right trim, and then the replace function. Okay, we'll take a look at some examples of those as well. So instring means that we're looking for a particular character in a string. Again, the instring, this guy over here, INSTR, he's used a lot of times in password verification functions. So maybe in your environment, your password is required to have a special character, such as a %sign or something like that. The instring could look through the password you supplied to see, does your password contain a special character? And if it does, it'll return the position in the string where it found it. If it doesn't, it'll return a 0. LPAD and RPAD, we can pad character strings either on the left or right with whatever character we tell it. LTrim and RTrim is kind of the opposite of that. We can take off characters off the left and the right of a string, whatever character we tell him to trim off. And then replace, we can replace characters or substrings with other characters or substrings. All right, let's look at some examples of those. Look at the instring here. We're selecting their last name, and then the instring function, the character string that we're evaluating is last name. And what are we looking for? We're looking for a lowercase I starting in position 1. We're looking for the first occurrence of that. So in other words, he's going to look for all names that contain an I, and if they do, he'll return the position where he found the I. And then here in the second one, very similar, but we're looking for if there is one, where is the second occurrence of an I in the name? And then we're also using here our column aliases that were discussed in an earlier module. Okay, now the second example here is an example of using the left pad. Again, our character string is last name, and the next item in our list as far as parameters goes, this is how long we want or expect the last name field to be. So we're expecting it to be 12 characters. Okay, so we're saying last name is 12 characters. Now what happens here is, if the last name is less than 12 characters, we're going to pad it on the left with an asterisk. Okay, so Smith will no longer be Smith when it is displayed. It'll be Smith with a series of asterisks on the front end of it. And if you add up all the asterisks and you add up all the letters in Smith, they'll add up to 12. Okay, and then you can do the opposite of that with RPad if you want to pad something on the right as well. Okay, so LPad is left pad, RPad is right pad. You tell it the length, you tell it what character to pad with. All right, some other examples here. We said the opposite of the pad is the trim. So we have R trim and left trim, or R trim and L trim for right and left. Up here, we're passing it the last name field. And on the right, we're saying trim off the S. So maybe we want something that's singular, not plural. We can trim off S's. It could be any character. You just tell it what character you're going to trim off the end of that character string. It might be a series of blanks that you're trying to get rid of. Or you could get rid of those asterisks that we just put on there by using the left trim or the R trim. All right, and then the last one here is the replace function. Okay, notice what we're trying to replace here. We just have a hard-coded string called the red dog. What do we want to replace? In that string, we want to replace the substring red with white. So if we look at that, the end result will be the white dog. We started off with the red dog, and again, we're doing that from the dual function here. So remember what dual is. Dual is that dummy table that has one record in it. We don't care what that record is. We don't care what the column is that represents that table. But if dual has one record in it, that means the replace function will run one time. Okay, so remember, the dual table is used often with functions, especially row functions that we're running here, that we want to run one time. So with that in mind, don't add any records to dual, don't remove any records from dual. That's going to cause a problem with somebody's output, either your own output or somebody else's down the road. The expectation is that dual will have one record in it. If you have any questions regarding any of these character functions in this module or any questions on other modules, feel free to use the question and comment box. We'll get back to you on those questions there. Following this module is another module that will demonstrate the usage of a lot of the character functions you saw in this module, so feel free to visit the next module and see some demonstrations of character functions. Thanks for joining us.